I've always loved the outdoors. The quiet, the fresh air, the sound of your boots crunching on the dirt trails. There's something about being in nature that helps clear the mind. I've hiked in several places across the country, from dense forests to barren mountaintops, and I thought I had seen it all. But that day, that was different. It all began with a quick decision. I had been planning to hike this particular trail, but something in me wanted to get away from the city for a bit longer, to escape the noise and chaos. The plan was simple: find a quiet trail, get in some good miles, and camp overnight. The trail I picked, Hidden Grove, was about 4 hours north of where I lived. It wasn't as well known as some of the other trails, but that's exactly what drew me to it. Not many people bothered to go up there. The forest was thick with trees, the air dense with the scent of pine and damp earth. When I parked my car at the trailhead, it felt like the world suddenly disappeared. It was just me, the trees, and the endless stretch of wilderness ahead. I checked my gear, a small backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit. I was used to hiking alone, and I made sure to carry what I needed to be self-sufficient. The sky was overcast, which was a bit concerning, but nothing I couldn't handle. I'd hiked in worse conditions. The first few miles were easy, the path winding through a forest dense with trees. The ground was soft, and the silence was profound. Every so often, a bird would call out from high above, but for the most part, it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Around the 2-hour mark, the weather took a turn. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above, and the sky darkened further. I thought it might rain, but I pressed on, figuring it would be just a quick shower. The trail started to get steeper, the trees taller and more imposing. It was like the forest was closing in around me. The path became less distinct, more overgrown, and I had to pay closer attention to where I was stepping. I had been hiking for nearly 3 hours when I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest had died down almost completely.
No birds.
No insects buzzing around, just silence. I stopped in my tracks and looked around, feeling a slight shiver crawl up my spine. Something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched. It wasn't like I hadn't been in quiet forests before, but this felt different, unnaturally quiet. I shook off the feeling and continued. Maybe it was just the weather or the time of day, I told myself. But then I heard something, a distant crack of a branch breaking under weight. The sound came from deeper in the forest, beyond my sight, but it was unmistakable, like someone or something was moving through the woods. I paused, listening. The air felt heavy, and I realized I had stopped breathing for a moment. The sound was gone now. My mind tried to rationalize it. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. It wasn't the sound of something natural. I stood there for a while, frozen. My heart was pounding in my chest. After what seemed like an eternity, I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. I hadn't come all this way to turn back now. I still had a few miles to go before I reached the campsite I had planned to set up in. The trail narrowed, and the trees grew so thick that I could barely see the sky above me. The wind howled through the branches, and I felt the first drop of rain against my skin. It wasn't much, just a few tiny drops, but it was enough to remind me that the weather had taken a turn for the worse. I reached a fork in the path and stopped to check my map. According to the trail guide, I was getting close to the campsite, but I wasn't sure which direction I needed to go. Neither trail looked particularly well marked. One path veered off sharply to the left, and the other continued straight ahead. I opted for the straight path, reasoning it was the most likely to take me to my destination. As I walked, the rain began to fall harder, the drizzle turning into a steady downpour. My clothes grew wet, and the ground beneath me became slippery. I focused on keeping my footing as I moved through the muddy path. It was then that I realized I hadn't seen a single sign or marker in a while. No trail markers, no footprints from other hikers, nothing. The forest had grown even quieter. Not just the absence of animal sounds, but the entire atmosphere felt still. The sound of rain hitting the leaves above me was the only noise, and it was almost deafening in its intensity. Then I saw it, a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, standing at the edge of the trail, but when I looked more closely, I realized there was something off about them. The figure was too still, too unnatural. It was hard to make out at first, just a shape between the trees, but then it became clear. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't a person. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach dropping. The figure was too tall, too thin. It had long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out at odd angles, as though it didn't belong in the human realm. The most unsettling thing was its head. There was something about it. It was large, almost too large for the rest of its body, with dark patches where eyes should have been, and a mouth that seemed too wide. I wanted to run, but my body was frozen. My feet wouldn't move, and my heart hammered against my ribcage. I stared at the figure for what felt like an eternity, and then, as if it had never been there, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next there was nothing. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, as fast as I could. I didn't care about the trail, the rain, or where I was going. All I could think about was getting out of there. My breath came in short, desperate gasps as I sprinted through the forest, barely watching where I was going. I slipped on the wet ground and tumbled once, scraping my hands, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. There was something wrong with this place, something dark and unnatural. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I reached a clearing. The rain had stopped, and the forest around me had grown eerily quiet. I stood there, panting, trying to gather my thoughts. I was lost. I had no idea where I was, and the night was fast approaching. I pulled out my map, but it was soaked, the ink smudged, and I couldn't make out the trail markings anymore. Panic surged in my chest. I was completely alone in this unfamiliar forest, and I didn't know which direction to go. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps crunching through the leaves. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I spun around, half expecting to see that figure again, but instead, I saw a small group of hikers. 3 of them. They were making their way through the clearing, looking just as drenched and exhausted as I felt. They seemed surprised to see me. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. I nodded, too out of breath to speak. They offered me a smile, though it looked more like a grimace from the way they were all staring. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were relieved to see me, but not in the way you'd expect. Something about their presence didn't feel right. "I think we might be lost," one of them said, looking at me, their voice tight. "The trail's a bit unclear. We've been walking for hours, and we're not sure where we're headed." I managed a nod, trying to act calm despite my racing heart. I hadn't expected to meet anyone else out here. In fact, I thought this trail was supposed to be quiet and relatively isolated. Yet here were these hikers, as if the forest had somehow drawn them in as well. They didn't say much more, but I felt the unease crawl through my chest. There was something off about them, something that made me wary, even though they didn't seem dangerous. Maybe it was the way they walked, like they were trying to blend into the surroundings, trying to avoid being noticed. "We should stick together," I suggested, my voice shaky, my thoughts scrambled. "We'll find the trailhead and get out of here." They agreed, and we started walking together. As we walked through the dense forest, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched again, just like before. But when I turned to check, the hikers were there beside me, their movements oddly synchronized. There was no one else. And then, in the fading light of the forest, something clicked in my mind. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something wasn't right. The air had grown thick again, heavier than it should have been. I could hear the distant sound of branches snapping under pressure. I slowed down, looking around in confusion. And then, as the last hint of sunlight disappeared, I understood. The forest wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. We weren't lost. The forest was keeping us here. I'd been hiking for hours, the trail winding through the dense forest, steep in some places, flat in others. My legs ached, and my backpack felt heavier with each step, but I pushed on. I had been planning this solo hike for months, wanting to disconnect from everything. I wasn't looking for adventure, just peace and solitude, away from the noise of city life. I'd chosen a remote route, one I'd read about in a hiking guide that promised a quiet escape. It was supposed to be simple. Find the trail, follow it, and then camp under the stars for a night of calm. The forest around me was thick with trees, their branches twisting and crisscrossing above my head, filtering the sunlight into jagged patches of light on the ground. The leaves crunched beneath my boots with each step, and the air was fresh, crisp with the scent of pine. At first, the sounds of the forest were peaceful, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant flow of a stream. But after a couple of hours, those sounds started to change. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly, but the woods felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to whip through the trees in sudden gusts, or how the shadows seemed longer than they should have been for the time of day. The more I walked, the more the feeling of unease crept in. I stopped for a break, sitting on a fallen log, drinking some water and trying to push the thoughts out of my head. It was probably just my mind playing tricks. I checked my map, tracing my finger along the trail. It wasn't that far now to the campsite, just a few more miles. The thought of setting up my tent and eating a hot meal gave me a bit of comfort. The idea of being alone for the night was supposed to be peaceful, but that uneasiness lingered. I got back on the trail, my feet heavy from the long walk, but the end was in sight. A mile or so left. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but then it happened again, clearer this time. The sound of footsteps. Not the kind of footsteps you make when you're hiking, but deliberate, heavy steps. It wasn't an animal either. It sounded human, but it was too rhythmic, too spaced out to be anyone hiking. I stopped immediately, listening carefully. I couldn't see anyone ahead on the path. The trees blocked most of my view, and the trail wasn't wide enough for anyone to be directly in my line of sight unless they were right behind a tree. But I didn't hear anything else for a moment. No footsteps, no movement. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but something deep down told me I wasn't alone out here. I picked up the pace, eager to get to the campsite, but the thought of someone being out here with me kept creeping into my mind. The more I walked, the more that feeling of being watched returned. It wasn't paranoia, not exactly. It was more like instinct, like my body was telling me to be cautious. Every few minutes, I'd look over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the woods, watching me. But nothing. The trail turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. Something out of place. A large rock sitting just off the trail with what looked like a pile of sticks and twigs on top of it. It wasn't naturally occurring. It wasn't just a random pile of branches. It was too neat, too deliberate, like someone had placed them there intentionally. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowed down, my heart beating faster. I didn't stop, but I moved around the pile quickly, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling it gave me. I tried to focus on my breathing and keep moving forward, but the weird pile was still in my thoughts. Why would anyone place it there? It wasn't a natural formation, and I didn't remember seeing it earlier when I passed the same spot. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. As the day wore on, The trail grew steeper and the forest darker. The trees around me were thicker now, their trunks towering above, blocking out more of the fading sunlight. I checked my map again. Only about 30 minutes to go. I could make it, but as I took another step, the noise came again. This time it was much closer. Footsteps, but they weren't behind me. They were ahead, and they were too loud to be anyone on the trail. I froze, staring ahead, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. My mind raced. I hadn't passed anyone all day. Who could it be? I called out a quick hello, but the forest swallowed my words. The footsteps kept coming, getting louder, as though someone was walking right towards me. My stomach tightened. I moved off the trail and into the brush, crouching behind a large tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, waiting for whatever was out there to appear. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just another hiker, and they had somehow gotten ahead of me without my noticing. But then I remembered that the trail had been deserted all day. No one had passed me. No one had been anywhere in sight. I waited for what felt like an eternity, not daring to make a sound. The forest around me seemed too still, the usual noises muffled, as if the whole place was holding its breath. Then, just when I thought I might be losing my mind, the footsteps started again. But this time they were moving away, slowly, deliberately, with a strange rhythm. I couldn't tell if the person was walking toward the trail or if they had stopped entirely, but I stayed where I was, barely breathing, hoping whoever or whatever it was wouldn't notice me. After what felt like forever, I finally stood up, inching toward the trail again, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The footsteps had stopped completely. The forest was quiet again. I didn't want to go back on the trail. I was scared, and my mind was racing. I needed to get out of there. I made the decision to turn around and head back. The campsite wasn't far, but the feeling that I wasn't alone had taken over. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, like there was something just beyond the trees, hidden from view. I had no proof, no clear reason to be afraid, but it was there, an undeniable gut feeling that I was being followed. I retraced my steps, backtracking along the path. But as I passed the spot with the rock and the sticks again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The pile of sticks was gone. Panic surged through me. I couldn't stop myself from looking around, my heart racing in my chest. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was out there, watching me. I picked up the pace, walking faster now, my footsteps quick and uneven. The forest around me felt like it was closing in, the trees crowding closer, and the shadows seemed deeper. My breath came in short gasps, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, waiting for something, anything to jump out at me. Then I saw it, a flash of movement, just beyond the trees. Someone, or something, was standing at the edge of the trail, hidden in the underbrush. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but whatever it was watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran. Adrenaline flooded my body, and I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the branches that scratched at my arms and the rocks that tripped me. My only focus was getting out of there, getting back to the safety of the trailhead. The sound of my footsteps was drowned out by the pounding of my heart in my ears. I ran, and I didn't stop until I saw the clearing ahead. The parking lot. I didn't know how long it took to get there, but when I finally burst out of the woods, I was shaking, gasping for air. I threw myself into the car, locked the doors, and just sat there, staring at the forest. Nothing followed me out. No one had been there. I never did find out what I had heard or seen on that trail. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something out there that I wasn't meant to understand. But whatever it was, it left me with a deep sense of unease that I still can't shake. I never went back to that trail, and I don't plan to. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing day hike. The kind you do to get away from the chaos of everyday life and just enjoy some fresh air. I was in my late 20s, an experienced hiker with a good amount of trails under my belt. This one was no different at first. At least that's what I told myself when I started out early that morning. The sun had just risen over the mountains, and the sky was painted with soft pastel hues. The air was cool, and the forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind passed through. It was peaceful. I'd planned a simple loop trail that was supposed to take about 4 hours, but I could feel something in the air that morning. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just the quiet and the emptiness of the trail. The path was narrow, winding between thick trees, with the occasional break in the canopy that let in a sliver of sunlight. I like trails like this where you could feel surrounded by nature, but still feel like you were in control. The birds chirped overhead, and the ground was soft, with thick moss covering the roots and stones. I was about an hour into the hike when things started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly. There was no obvious danger or threat, but it was as though something wasn't right. I took a deep breath and tried to push the uneasy feeling out of my mind. Maybe it was the solitude. After all, it was still early, and I hadn't passed anyone yet. I kept walking, my boots crunching softly on the dirt, moving with a steady rhythm. But the unease didn't leave. In fact, it started to grow. It wasn't the type of fear you feel when you're genuinely scared. More like a quiet, nagging discomfort that won't go away. It started when I noticed the trail beginning to branch off. I wasn't expecting a split this early into the hike. According to the map I'd studied before starting, this loop was supposed to be straightforward. But now there was a fork, and neither path seemed to be marked. I stopped, pulled out the map, and tried to make sense of it. There were no signs, no trail markers, and nothing that told me which way was the right one. I couldn't help but feel the pressure building in my chest. I stared at the map for a few more minutes, trying to convince myself that this was just part of the trail, that everything was fine. I chose the path to the left, thinking it might eventually loop back to the main trail. The trail became narrower and more overgrown as I continued, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The silence was heavy now, broken only by the sound of my footsteps. The air felt thicker, the humidity rising. Sweat started to bead on my forehead, though the temperature hadn't changed much. As I walked deeper into the woods, I started to hear something that made my heart race. It wasn't an animal, not exactly. It was more of a scraping sound, like branches or twigs being dragged across the ground. But it didn't stop. It followed me, and the longer it went on, the more I realized it wasn't the wind or any natural noise. It was something deliberate. A chill crept up my spine. I kept walking, trying to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a squirrel or some other small creature, but I knew that wasn't it. The sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. It felt like it was always just behind me. I picked up my pace, my heart beating harder. But the noise grew louder. It was too close now, too close to be ignored. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just trees. The path had gotten steeper, the ground uneven. I had to watch my footing more carefully now. The scratching noise grew louder, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I thought I saw a figure, just a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. But when I looked again, nothing was there. I knew something was wrong. The forest felt wrong. The trail was wrong. Every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. But it wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I realized just how much I'd lost my way. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trees had opened up, but instead of being met with a peaceful view of the valley below, I was staring at a patch of dead ground. The trees around me were twisted and gnarled, as though they'd been here for centuries, but had long since died. The ground was covered in dry, cracked soil, and the air felt suffocating, as though the very atmosphere had changed. I spun around, my stomach churning. The path I'd been on had completely disappeared. The trees on either side were now just a thick wall of dark trunks. I wasn't supposed to be here. I retraced my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves had all gone silent. It was as if the whole world had just stopped. I felt a creeping panic rise in my chest. It wasn't the first time I'd gotten lost on a trail, but this felt different. I'd never felt so alone. I tried to stay calm. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was nothing. No bars.
No GPS.
Just a blank screen. I knew the rules of hiking. Stay put, stay calm, retrace your steps. But as I stood there in the clearing, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I wasn't alone. I tried to call out, but my voice felt small and weak in the vast emptiness of the forest. There was no response. I couldn't stay here. I forced myself to move again, but this time, every sound around me seemed amplified. My breathing, the crunch of my footsteps, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. All of it felt too loud, too intense. Suddenly, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a twig snapping underfoot, but then it grew louder, closer. A figure emerged from behind one of the trees, moving with the same strange, deliberate pace I had heard earlier. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, but they weren't moving like a normal person. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were trying to hide something. I took a step back, but my foot caught on a rock, sending me stumbling to the ground. I couldn't take my eyes off them. They just stood there watching me. I could feel the blood drain from my face, my heart racing faster than I thought possible. But something deep inside me snapped. Panic turned to determination. I wasn't going to die here. I wasn't going to let this person, this thing, get any closer. I bolted, running as fast as I could, dodging branches and leaping over rocks. I had no idea where I was going, just that I couldn't stay. I heard them behind me, moving fast, but I couldn't risk looking back. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my breath ragged. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, I broke through the thick trees and into a wider path. I skidded to a stop, gasping for air. My surroundings were unfamiliar, but the air felt lighter, less oppressive. I wasn't sure if I was still being followed. I didn't care. I just had to get out. I kept walking, not stopping to rest, not slowing down until the sound of running water reached my ears. I followed the sound and found a creek, its water sparkling under the late morning sun. I knelt down, drinking the cool, refreshing water, my hands trembling. That's when I heard voices. It wasn't just one person. There were more. A group of hikers making their way up the trail. Relief flooded through me. I didn't speak to them. I didn't want to scare them, but I knew I had to tell someone. I turned back to look at the forest one last time. The trees stood silent, unmoving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting. Something had been there. Something had followed me. The trail may have been simple at first, but it had taken me somewhere I never wanted to go again. And as I walked back down the mountain with the group, I promised myself I'd never hike alone again. I had planned the hike for months, a solo trip deep into the mountains, away from everything. No cell service, no roads, just me and the wilderness. It wasn't my first solo hike, but it was definitely my most ambitious. A 70-mile loop through rugged terrain, with elevations climbing past 9,000 feet, and the promise of absolute solitude. I had my gear, my maps, my food carefully portioned out. I checked the weather multiple times, clear for the next 10 days. Everything should have gone smoothly. The first 2 days were incredible. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, and the air was so crisp and clean that every breath felt like a fresh start. I moved efficiently, covering ground fast but stopping enough to soak in the landscape. Nights were quiet, the kind of silence you forget exists when you live in a city. It was exactly what I had wanted. On the third day, something changed. It started with a feeling. I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it. I hadn't seen a single soul since leaving the trailhead, but every so often, I'd stop and feel like someone or something was watching me. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. I was in the middle of nowhere after all. That evening, as I set up camp by a small lake, I noticed something strange. The ground near my site had fresh footprints. Not mine. They were large, deeper than my own, and heading in an odd direction, straight toward my camp before veering off into the woods. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an old footprint washed out by the recent rain? Maybe I had stepped there earlier and just forgot? But it didn't make sense. My gut told me someone else had been here very recently. I ate my dinner quickly and set up my bear bag far from my tent. I stayed up later than usual, listening to the stillness of the forest. Every twig snap made my skin prickle. When I finally forced myself to sleep, I did so with my knife in my sleeping bag. Day 4 was when things escalated. I woke up to find something missing. My camp stove, which had been packed up neatly the night before, was gone. My first thought was an animal, a bear maybe, but nothing else had been touched. My food was untouched, my pack unzipped but not rummaged through. Animals don't take just one thing and leave the rest. I searched the area, moving in slow circles outward from my camp. About 20 yards into the trees, I found it. The stove was placed neatly on a flat rock. No damage, nothing broken. It hadn't been dragged, it had been carried. Set down carefully, like someone wanted me to know they'd been there. I should have left right then, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe another hiker passed through and thought they were helping by moving my stuff? Maybe I had done it and just forgotten? I knew deep down those were weak excuses, but I wanted to believe them. I packed up and moved on. By midday, I felt watched again. I kept turning around, scanning the trees. Nothing. But then I saw it, about 100 feet off the trail, half hidden behind a tree, was a shape. Human? Couldn't tell. It didn't move. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to keep walking. Whatever was back there didn't follow, at least not that I could see. I kept checking over my shoulder, but the trees swallowed everything behind me. That night, I set up camp in a dense section of forest. I made a fire more for comfort than warmth. I ate, triple-checked my gear, and forced myself to act normal. But I didn't feel normal. I felt hunted. I barely slept. Every noise outside my tent set my nerves on fire. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something new. Not an animal. Not the wind. A human sound. Breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate breathing. It was just outside my tent. I stopped breathing myself, heart pounding in my ears. I reached slowly for my knife, gripping it so hard my hand hurt. The breathing stayed steady. Close. Too close. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No retreating footsteps. No rustling in the brush. Just silence. I waited until dawn to move. The second there was enough light, I tore down my camp and started hiking faster than I ever had before. I didn't eat, barely drank water. I just moved. I had 2 days left before I reached my car. I was too far in to turn around, and the nearest ranger station was still over 20 miles away. I felt exposed on the trail. Whoever was out there knew where I was, but I had no idea where they were. By midday, exhaustion set in. I forced myself to stop at a stream to refill my water. That's when I saw something that turned my stomach to ice. A piece of fabric, tangled in the bushes. Dark blue, the same color as my spare shirt. My spare shirt that had been deep in my pack the night before. I yanked my bag off my shoulders and tore through it. My spare clothes were gone. So was my backup knife. Someone had been in my tent while I slept. I don't remember the next few hours clearly. I just walked, fast. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. Every few minutes I glanced back. Nothing. I started thinking maybe I was losing my mind. Then I found the footprints. Not mine, fresh. And they weren't just crossing the trail. They were following it. Following me. I broke into a run. I didn't care about injury, didn't care about exhaustion. I ran until my body refused to go any further. Then I walked until I could run again. By nightfall, I knew I wouldn't make it to my car that day. I had to stop, but I couldn't camp. Not normally. I climbed a tree. I wedged myself into the branches, gripping my knife so hard my knuckles hurt. I didn't sleep, barely blinked. I just sat, staring down at the forest below. Sometime in the night, I heard them. Footsteps. Slow, steady. Searching. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The footsteps circled below me. Stopped. Then the worst sound of all. A whisper. Not words. Just a low, almost thoughtful sound. Like whoever it was knew I was there. Then they walked away. I waited until full daylight to climb down. My body was stiff, aching, but I didn't care. I ran. I ran until I hit the dirt road leading to the trailhead, where my car sat alone. I have never run so fast in my life. I locked the doors the second I was inside, barely able to get the keys in the ignition because my hands were shaking so badly. I drove straight to the nearest town, not stopping for anything. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? I checked the news for weeks, looking for reports of missing hikers, strange sightings. Nothing. But I know someone was out there, watching, waiting, and they knew I was there too. I had been hiking alone for hours, just me and the trail. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. It was the kind of solitude I sought, the kind where you could almost hear your thoughts clearly, without the distractions of the outside world. The woods around me were dense, dark in places, with long shadows creeping over the rocky path. The trail was getting steeper, winding up toward the ridge where the views were supposed to be amazing, or so the guidebook claimed. I'd been on this trail before, but today something felt different. The usual rustling of leaves and birdsong had faded away, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to settle deeper with every step I took. I told myself it was probably just the usual quiet of the woods in the late afternoon, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. Felt too quiet. The further I climbed, the more the feeling lingered. I hadn't seen any other hikers since the last group passed me hours ago, their laughter still echoing faintly in my mind. But now there was nothing, just me, the trees, and the steep incline. A sudden crack of a twig broke the stillness, and my heart skipped. I turned quickly, but all I saw was the darkening forest behind me, stretching out in every direction. I couldn't tell if the noise had been from an animal or something else, but it felt like it had come from somewhere near, somewhere close. My eyes scanned the shadows, my ears straining for any sound, but nothing. Shaking it off, I pressed on, deciding to focus on the trail ahead of me. The path had become rockier now, with jagged boulders that made each step more difficult. As I took a breath and wiped the sweat from my brow, I looked down the steep slope to my left. There, in a small clearing, I noticed something unusual. A large, flat rock with a weird symbol carved into its surface. Curious, I made my way down toward it, my boots crunching against the loose gravel. As I got closer, I could see the symbol was carved deep into the rock, a series of circles and lines that didn't seem to make any sense. The whole thing gave me an uncomfortable feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I paused for a moment, contemplating whether I should touch it or not. My instinct was to leave, but something about the strange marking tugged at me, as if it were calling me in. I bent down and ran my fingers over the grooves. The rock was cold, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. A chill ran up my spine as I stood up quickly, deciding it was best to get back on the trail. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something else. A rustling sound coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't like the usual animal sounds I was used to hearing. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. I froze. The rustling grew louder, closer. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My heart started to pound in my chest. I slowly turned, my gaze sweeping across the dense trees. Nothing, just shadows. Yet, the noise persisted, still coming closer. Panic set in. I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks, but the thought of being followed was terrifying. The trail up ahead seemed long, and I knew I'd be out in the open for a while before the ridge offered any safety. My legs felt heavy, but I pushed on, forcing myself to keep moving. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, but saw no one, just trees and rocks, and the fading light of the day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for me. As the trail leveled off, I could see the ridge just ahead, but I still hadn't shaken the odd sensation that something was off. It was as if the woods were closing in around me, and no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't escape the strange, suffocating presence that seemed to follow. Then, in the distance, I spotted something that made my heart stop. A figure standing just off the trail, partially hidden behind a large boulder. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but there was something about the way they stood that made me uneasy. They were completely still, not moving a muscle. No backpack, no gear, just a figure, staring at me. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't budge, didn't speak, just watched me. I took a tentative step forward, my voice caught in my throat. The figure remained motionless. Another step, and then I heard it, a voice, or rather a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was there. So faint it could have been the wind, but it wasn't the wind. Leave. I froze, my entire body going rigid. It was a soft voice, but there was a clear sense of urgency in it. Without thinking, I took a step back, and the figure finally moved, slowly but deliberately, as if it were not a person at all but something else. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran for. My legs burned, and my breath came in desperate gasps, but I didn't stop. The fear that gripped me kept me moving, kept me from looking back, though I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, keeping pace. As I sprinted down the trail, the sun sank lower, and the shadows grew deeper. I don't know how I made it back to the clearing with the trailhead, but when I reached it, the forest behind me seemed to exhale. The air was no longer thick with the sense of dread. The sky was darkening, and I could see the lights of the parking lot far ahead, but I didn't dare stop until I was safely inside my car. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't look back at the woods as I drove away, but the image of that figure stayed with me. That strange voice still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was something out there, something waiting in those woods, something that didn't want me there. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I never went back to that trail again. Something about it felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I wasn't meant to understand. The woods were no longer a place of peace for me, but a place of unknowns, a place where I'd learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the quiet, hidden forces that we don't see coming until it's almost too late. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the solitude, the rawness of nature, and the challenge of pushing myself that made it worth every aching muscle and blister. It wasn't about escaping life. It was about immersing myself in something greater than me. That's why I picked the remote trail deep in the mountains, a place few people ever went. I started early, just before dawn. My pack was loaded with the essentials: food, water, a small first aid kit, a map, and my trusty knife. The trailhead was marked, but from the start, it was clear this wasn't a well-traveled path. The dirt was packed, but uneven. Vegetation grew thick around the narrow route, occasionally slapping against my legs as I moved forward. The morning air was crisp, and the silence of the forest was only interrupted by the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird. The first few hours were uneventful. I kept a steady pace, taking in the beauty of my surroundings. Towering pines lined the trail, their needles forming a soft carpet beneath my boots. The sun broke through the gaps in the trees, creating golden patches of light that danced on the ground. It was peaceful. Then, around midday, I noticed something strange. The further I hiked, the less wildlife I saw. Normally, I'd at least hear the chatter of birds, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. But now it was just silence, the kind that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I ignored it at first, assuming it was just the elevation or my own mind playing tricks. But as I continued, the silence became oppressive. It wasn't just quiet, it felt wrong, unnatural, like something was watching me. I brushed off the feeling and kept going. I had mapped out a good stopping point, a small clearing by a river where I planned to set up camp for the night. The thought of reaching it gave me a sense of relief. I was looking forward to resting my feet and enjoying a meal. The first real sign that something was off came when I spotted the tracks. At first, I thought they were from another hiker, but as I knelt to get a better look, I realized they weren't human. They were too large, too deep. They resembled bear tracks, but something about them was wrong. The shape was slightly off, the toe marks too elongated. I stood up, scanning my surroundings, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. I hadn't seen another person all day. The trail was supposed to be remote, but this kind of isolation felt eerie. I tightened my grip on the knife strapped to my belt and pressed forward, quickening my pace. As the day wore on, the unease grew. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I swore I saw movement in the trees. But every time I stopped and turned to look, there was nothing, just the endless stretch of forest. My skin prickled with an anxious energy I couldn't shake. When I finally reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The river was just as beautiful as I had imagined. Its water clear and cold, the sound of it rushing over rocks soothing in the growing darkness. I quickly set up camp, pitching my small tent and lighting a fire. The warmth was a comfort, pushing back against the chill of the night air. As I ate my dinner, I tried to shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just exhaustion. My mind was playing tricks, feeding on the natural fear of being alone in the wild. But deep down, I knew better. Then, just as I was getting ready to turn in for the night, I heard it, a sound, distant at first but unmistakable, a low, guttural breathing. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was coming from beyond the firelight, somewhere in the trees. I strained my eyes, but the darkness was thick, impenetrable. Then a twig snapped. I reached for my knife, my fingers closing around the handle in a white-knuckled grip. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A mountain lion? But something told me it wasn't either of those. The breathing grew louder, closer. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. And then, in the flickering firelight, I saw it just for a second. A shape, a shadow just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was tall, too tall. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my pack and my flashlight, stuffing essentials inside with shaky hands. I kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the clearing into darkness. My only chance was to move, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was out there as possible. I didn't run. Running in the dark was a death sentence. But I moved quickly, carefully, my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I retraced my steps back down the trail. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. The breathing followed. My stomach twisted with fear. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I could name. And it wasn't stopping. For hours I hiked, pushing my body to its limit. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't dare stop for long. The further I went, the more the sounds faded, until finally, blessedly, the forest was silent again. By the time I saw my car parked at the trailhead, the sun was beginning to rise. I didn't waste a second. I threw my pack into the back seat, locked the doors, and sped down the empty road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I never went back to that trail, never told anyone what happened, because even now, years later, I can't explain it. I don't know what was out there, watching me. I only know that I was never supposed to see it, and I know it saw me. I had been planning this trip for weeks. I wanted to get away for a while, clear my head, and test myself against nature. I had hiked plenty before, day trips, a few overnights, but never anything too intense. This time, I wanted to go deep. I wanted to be alone, just me and the wilderness. The trail I picked wasn't popular. It was one of those old logging roads that had been mostly forgotten, winding up into the mountains before disappearing into a network of game trails and half-maintained paths. I had mapped out a route that would take me up through the ridgeline and then down into a valley where a river cut through the land. The plan was to follow the river until I found a good spot to camp, then loop back the next day. It was supposed to be simple. The first few miles were easy. The air was cool, the sun filtering through the trees just right, making the world feel almost peaceful. I had my pack snug on my shoulders, my boots steady on the dirt. I had checked the weather before leaving. Clear skies, no storms on the horizon. Everything was perfect. I had started early in the morning, and by noon, I had made it to the ridgeline. The view was incredible, the valley stretching out below me, the river a thin silver line cutting through the trees. I took a short break, had a granola bar, drank some water, and then started my descent. That's where things started to go wrong. The trail was steeper than I expected, the ground loose beneath my feet. I had to take it slow, planting my feet carefully with each step. About halfway down, I slipped. Not a full fall, but enough to jolt me. My ankle twisted under me, sending a sharp pain up my leg. I cursed, steadied myself, and tested my weight. It hurt, but not enough to stop me. I told myself it was fine, just a small sprain. I could walk it off. I kept going, slower now, more careful. The trail grew narrower, the trees closing in around me. The ground was uneven, roots jutting out, rocks half buried in the dirt. Every step sent a dull ache through my ankle, but I pushed through. I had come too far to turn back. By the time I reached the valley floor, the sun was lower in the sky than I had expected. I had taken longer than planned, and I still needed to find a campsite. I followed the river, searching for a flat, dry spot. My ankle throbbed with every step, but I ignored it. Then I saw it, a clearing near the water, big enough for my tent. with a few fallen logs nearby that would make decent seating. It looked perfect. I dropped my pack, stretched out my leg, and started setting up camp. By the time I had my tent pitched and a small fire going, the sun was dipping below the trees. I ate a quick meal, just some dehydrated food and a protein bar, then sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. The river rushed softly nearby. The wind rustled the leaves. Crickets chirped somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful. Then I noticed something that didn't belong. A sound, faint at first. A soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. I tensed, listening. Probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, but something felt off. The sound wasn't moving away. It was staying close, just beyond the light of my fire. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness. Nothing, just trees, shadows shifting in the flickering firelight. I told myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks. The woods are full of sounds. Animals move, branches fall. It's normal. I forced myself to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every little noise had me wide awake, my heart pounding. But eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, my skin cold, my body tense. The fire had died down to embers. The night was silent, too silent. No wind,
No crickets.
just stillness. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locking up. I reached for my knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle. My flashlight was next to me, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see what was out there. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I don't know. Eventually, the sounds faded. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped my tent, my stomach dropped. The ground around my camp was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints. They circled my tent. I packed up fast. My ankle was worse, swelling now, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. I didn't eat, didn't drink. Just grabbed my gear and started moving. The hike back was brutal. Every step sent pain shooting through my leg. I pushed forward, barely stopping. I don't know how long it took, but when I finally saw my car, relief flooded through me so hard I almost collapsed. I locked the doors the second I got inside. I didn't look back. I just started the engine and drove. I never told anyone what happened. Not really. Just said the hike was tough, that I hurt my ankle, that I had to cut it short. But I still think about it. I still wonder who or what was out there with me, and what would have happened if I hadn't woken up.